Or they can go here or go there and get this benefit or that benefit. They don't need me anymore. You see what happens? It takes away the personal self-sacrifice, which is a key spiritual issue involving your personal salvation. You see what Rome is trying to do? And not just Rome, the kings of the earth and the merchants of the earth who collaborate with her. It's very big. And it's global. It's on a global scale. Arne Duncan, who is President Obama's education secretary, made this comment. He said, education is still the key to eliminating gender inequalities, to reducing poverty, to creating a sustainable planet. What's that talking about? That's climate change. All right, remember that? We talked about that, didn't we? All right. And to fostering peace. Today, education is a global public good, unconstrained by national boundaries. In other words, it's global. It is no surprise that economic interdependence brings new global challenges and educational demands. Wow, what a statement by the United States Education Secretary. He spoke of sustainability, which of course is UN speak for central planning and global government. He's a globalist, just like all the rest. Notice the mention also of gender inequality. That's globalist speak for doing all sorts of things with gender, including for various gender and sexual orientations. Nowadays, the latest thing is gender bending. You know what that means. Well, we studied this in Daniel chapter 1, didn't we? I mentioned also the other night 3 girls in Fortaleza, Brazil, that came to me one night. Remember I mentioned that? And they told me that their nation, their textbooks in their nation are already designed around the globalist concepts. And that high school teacher in Australia who's saying that the cities are the control towers, he made it very clear that they are globalizing the education that he has to teach to high school students in his school. So education is being refocused on global responsibility versus national responsibility, and children are being taught that supranational government is good. They're taught internationalism, which is another term for supranational governments. Now, law is also being merged with globalization or with the New World Order or in the New World Order. It's one of the key foundation principles. There's a great desire to get rid of Western constitutions. Did you hear what I said? Great desire to get rid of Western constitutions, especially the U.S. Constitution. Even Supreme Court justices these days are reinterpreting the language of the Constitution and adding new rights, using international law and making decisions, etc. All sorts of things. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg paid a visit to the Egyptians after the uprising that ousted Hosni Mubarak. And she said that they should not look to the U.S. Constitution when creating their own. This is a Supreme Court justice saying this. Imagine. And she's incumbent, by the way. She said, I would not look to the U.S. Constitution if I were drafting a constitution in the year 2012. That's when she went to visit them. I might look at the Constitution of South Africa. Wow. South Africa, of course, is one of those places that is very constricting of personal liberties and rights. She went on to say that was a deliberate attempt to have a fundamental instrument of government that embraced basic human rights. I don't think so. And had an independent judiciary much more recent than the U.S. Constitution. Canada has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It dates from 1982. So she said, go look somewhere else. Don't look at the U.S. Constitution. In spite of the fact that the U.S. Constitution has been around for 200 years and has successfully, is responsible for making America prosperous. Let's just put it that way. You would almost certainly look at the European Convention on Human Rights, she added. Yes, why not take advantage of what there is elsewhere in the world? I would say there's nothing comparable to the U.S. Constitution. She should have been saying that this is where they should be looking. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a globalist. She is a person who believes in the New World Order. And she's quite anxious to keep people from copying the U.S. Constitution. But what she's really saying is that the U.S. Constitution isn't worth the paper it's written on. We need a new one, like the one in South Africa, or Canada, or the European Union for that matter. Well, South Africa's constitution is socialist, which you would expect from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Canada's Human Rights Commission is abusive of religious liberty. They've arrested people for speaking out against homosexuals and so on up in Canada, even though they quote the Bible. In fact, in one case, the man was only quoting the Bible, and they arrested him, charged him with human rights abuses. To achieve the New World Order, one of the foundational principles is that they must change the U.S. Constitution. And by the way, that's in the Bible. Come back to Revelation 13 again. The Bible actually tells us that the U.S. Constitution will have to be overthrown. It doesn't use those words, but it describes what has to happen. Notice verse 15. Revelation chapter 13, verse 15. It says, He had power to give life unto the image of the beast. That's the United States. That the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So right there, speaking of the United States, which then becomes like a dragon, speaks like a dragon, creates this image that everybody has to worship and starts to require people to worship that image. In order to accomplish that, you have to get rid of the U.S. Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights. And not only the First Amendment. Not only the First Amendment, which is where the Bill of Rights is. It has to take away everything else as well. That's why Ellen White makes a very interesting statement. She says that the U.S. Constitution, every principle of the U.S. Constitution will be repudiated. You cannot have a viable U.S. Constitution and be able to accomplish what Revelation 13 verse 15 says. Therefore, the Bible is predicting that the U.S. Constitution will be gutted of its most important rights and freedoms in that Constitution. But international laws that govern are really about the loss of sovereignty. When you have a law that is a supranational law over several nations, like you have in the European Union, for instance, we're talking about the loss of sovereignty of a nation. A nation that willingly gives up its sovereignty to be part of a larger group of nations. And that's very, very offensive to the U.S. Constitution. But yet that's happening all the time. And there are a host of organizations that are involved in this. The World Trade Organization, the UN, the World Bank controls this through loans. The list is long, my friends, and there are other organizations working for it as well, like the CFR, which is the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, and so on. There are many, many organizations pushing this particular agenda. So sovereignty is being eroded rather rapidly by international trade treaties. Did you hear that word, trade? Trade treaties. That's the foundation of global unity around politics and economics. You cannot have unity without trade agreements. And so they start there because they seem innocuous, but they ultimately lead to political integration and economic integration for that matter. International trade treaties are involved, but also there are human rights treaties. international commodities and resource treaties, such as the law of the sea. Ever heard of the law of the sea? It's a new international law it's already been passed, but it's not been accepted by the United States yet. Thank God the angels are still holding back the winds of strife. But basically it takes control by international entities over the sea and all fishing and resources, whatever resources there are in the sea. Climate change governance will have a major impact on globalization because it's a global issue. Climate change, quote unquote, is a global issue. Whether you agree with it or not, it is a global issue, and they're using it as a basis to justify global controls, supranational controls, and thereby the loss of sovereignty. It's a global problem, so it requires a global solution. So what is the foundation of all this globalization? Well, the underlying philosophy is that no religious laws can be imposed worldwide under the current and at times chaotic system of control, especially when nation states set their own political and, of course, their economic agendas. So there must be a superstate, and nations must give up their sovereignty. That's very difficult. Much of it, of course, has to be done in secret. And this is one of the secrets, prophetic secrets of the New World Order. Jean-Claude Juncker, who was once the president of the European Central Bank before Mario Draghi, when he was president of the Central Bank, he's now the president of the European Commission, which makes the rules and regulations for the economy and trade and employment and so on in Europe. He's now the president of that. But when he was the president of the ECB, he said, "I am for secret, dark debates. When the going gets tough, you have to lie." That's one of the leaders of Europe right now. Wonderful. You can have confidence in him, can't you? The superstate known as the European Union is a good example of how it all develops. Based in Brussels, the European Union increasingly controls every aspect of European life. We'll be talking about that a bit more later on. The EU gradually increased the economic integration until it was time for a common currency. They started with trade, and eventually it became, a political thing, and with a central common currency. The euro dramatically changed the political state of things. Again, we'll talk about that in a little while. The common currency, however, has pushed the nations to more political integration because of the economic crisis. They now have to force themselves to get together. And so it's basically reuniting Europe under the principles of the Holy Roman Empire. But I mentioned trade. Trade and business corporations are also consolidating. It's not just governments, but it's organizations and businesses and corporations. They consolidate in line with the New World Order. Big corporations see certain things coming, and so they know that if they don't get bigger and control more market share, they will lose out in the global economy. So they have several incentives to merge with other companies, while the central banks provide easy money through which they can do this. And often the quantitative easing, which is the expansion of the money supply, is involved in that. And you have a lot of companies recently that have merged, AOL and Yahoo. There are 6 big airlines that are now 3 airlines in the United States. Heinz Foods and Kraft Foods just recently merged. Many banks and investment companies have merged in the recent years as well. Their larger and larger assets are continually being tied together. Friends, men become proud of their achievements. Money and wealth is concentrated into the hands of fewer and fewer people. Well, it all comes about by various trade agreements and treaties. But friends, let us remember that in the last days there is going to be not only a global worship imposed on this whole planet, but something else. Revelation 14 tells us that there's also going to be a global message that God gives us to give to the people. And we'll talk about that during our next study as we move into more depth of how globalization is structured. Let's bow our heads as we close. Father in heaven, thank you for the Bible that gives us such a clear definition of how the end is going to unfold. Thank you for giving us discernment to see the signs of the times that are unfolding right before us. And Father in heaven, we pray that you'll give us wisdom to understand that salvation is in Jesus Christ, not in these global institutions and entities. Father in heaven, keep our minds focused, not on the things around us and the world around us so much as on Jesus Christ and the power of God to transform our lives. But we must watch and pray as we see these things unfold, and so we ask your blessing to help us discern them, the signs of the times that Jesus is coming soon in the clouds of glory. And we thank you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.